Yeah, I think it's funny, like, because when you have bills that are going to limit the actions of kids online, they're also going to limit the unforeseeable and creative ways that children use platforms. I'm thinking of, for instance, the fact that kids in China are able to circumvent censorship because of the way that they use video games. Video games, the quintessential example of addictive behavior. Well, kids are actually using the in-game chat platforms in
Exactly.
video games to get information that they can't through the normal mechanisms because those websites are blocked within China.
Yeah.
So they're chat friends internationally, and they're able to get that information from their friends, in a way that is completely unforeseeable, not even on the radar for legislators, because they're just seeing video games as addictive.
Welcome to the new millennium. It's just as we predicted. Picture phones, space stations, moon bases, flying cars, warp drive.
But I don't have to know an answer. I don't feel frightened by not knowing things. By being lost in the mysterious universe without having any purpose, which is the way it really is as far as I can tell, possibly. It doesn't frighten me.
Welcome to Unschooling Future, where children are people.
Okay, we checked all 4 systems, and there you go on modulation, all 4, and keying was a go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hello and welcome to Season 3 of the Unschooling Future Podcast. This whole season will be devoted to kids and teens' digital rights and access to information. This is because I'm writing and illustrating what partially will be a comic book about kids and teens' freedom to self-direct their online learning. The book will be called Free to Browse. What are the main concerns about the newly introduced Kids Online Safety Act, KOSA? What are the stumbling blocks on the way to tech literacy and proficiency? Why, in the 21st century liberal West, do we see so much talent and resources going into surveillance tech? And what strategies will today's young minds pick to survive this phase in the internet's development? Is it just a phase? To quote my son Simon, I still find it astonishing that it's a privacy law that kids should not have any privacy. For this episode, I sat down with the digital freedoms nonprofit Electronic Frontier Foundation, or EFF. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Bill Budington, Senior Staff Technologist on EFF's Public Interest Technology team, and Jason Kelley, EFF's Associate Director of Digital Strategy.
EFF is the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and we're a public interest nonprofit based in the Bay Area. We have issues that span the globe. And we kind of consist of this mythical triforce of activists, technologists, and lawyers who work on digital privacy issues and digital security and promoting innovation and making sure that your rights are protected with you when you go online.
And I got first attracted to reading about your organization and getting in touch because I saw this wonderful article that you posted about the introduced new Kids Online Safety Act.
It's bad.
Maybe we could kick off with that. You posted it in March this year.
Yeah, I'm happy to give an overview of the kind of legislation that KOSA is, the Kids Online Safety Act. It's a bill intended to kind of update COPPA, and COPPA is the law that essentially says what internet service providers or online platforms, essentially websites, et cetera, have to do when they interact with people under 13. So if you go to a website and it asks you for your age and you have to type that in, that's like partly because of COPPA. And COPPA hasn't been updated in a very long time. There are lots of different ideas about how to update it. And the Kids Online Safety Act is kind of one of those ideas. And it's kind of I would say its focus is less protecting the privacy of young people, which is what COPPA's focus generally is, and more aimed at minimizing sort of the content young people can see, right? And so there's like two ways to think about the legislation that's being introduced right now around young people's online rights, and how they access websites and the internet generally. And one is thinking about their privacy and what data can be collected for people under a certain age. And the other is thinking about what kind of content they can kind of interact with. And KOSA is one that generally aims to minimize sort of, let's say, dangerous content that young people might encounter, in the same way that a parental app or a similar kind of app, an accountability app, if you will, can make sure that parents or teachers or whatever the adult kind of is in a situation can protect supposedly young people from content that fits into a variety of categories, whether that's, the obvious like pornography, or the less obvious like content about self-harm, content about eating disorders, content about suicide, things like that, which are much more complicated in a lot of ways to filter out. So KOSA's goal is to update COPPA, but really in a way that minimizes the kind of information young people would be able to access when they go online.
And what is the issue with that, in your opinion? Because I can already hear you saying, instead of protecting kids' privacy, which is a whole big topic, whether COPPA was doing that correctly, but at least it wasn't as far going as what I've been reading about, the prerequisites for KOSA is that, for example, it will be partially introducing monitoring the data even at the browser level, or even maybe like biometrically making sure that you identify yourself, like in terms of facial recognition. I see immediately two issues. The one that just jumps at me is that you will actually have to be collecting even more data, and what's going to be in charge of that. And secondly, which in terms of what interests me most, is that I think it primarily violates children's human rights in their access to information. And I think that in this very intricate process of learning and self-directed learning that online has so beautifully facilitated, crudely micromanaging it completely ruins the whole process of like looking for things, algorithms following your interests, because it is just like micromanaging evolution basically, or any other self-unfolding process.
Yeah, I'll give a quick kind of rundown of some of the problems we see, and then Bill, maybe you could talk a little bit about sort of the technical dilemmas with some of the kind of plans for bills like this. Bill, acts like this, laws like this. So as you mentioned, there's a problem with, first of all, trying to figure out how old a user is online. Right now, COPPA allows people to sort of declare their age, and this has bothered many people for a long time, people who want more strict age verification processes, whether those are some sort of account that you create that shows that you're above a certain age, that's like tied to a credit card or something like that, or a driver's license, or let's say in the case of Instagram, which introduced something recently where you can take a picture of yourself, and Instagram sends that picture, the selfie, to a age verification company that doesn't collect any information, at least theoretically. It just analyzes the image to determine how old you are. And if the analyzer says, and this is all algorithmic, there's not a person involved. Of course, all the software and everything was created by people, so there were many people involved, but it's all supposed to happen automatically. And that's sort of the first question with KOSA is it a good idea to know more about people online if you're trying to protect them. Is it a good idea to know the age of every single user for sure? Is it a good idea to tie that information to other details about a person, right? So there's no good way to figure out how old someone is and sort of collect that information and hold on to it without surveilling the user around the internet, essentially. So that sort of age verification problem is the first issue. And then the second is the censorship point that you mentioned, that there's like, really the goal is to, everyone knows about, probably everyone listening to this knows about parental kind of apps that you install on a phone, or for a young person, you install on their computer, and it shows the parent sort of what the kid is doing, and then also allows you to say, I don't think they should be looking at this, I don't think they should be looking at that. And then the app minimizes those things in certain ways, either correctly or incorrectly. And the goal of KOSA is to sort of blow that up and make it so that it's on every site. So that right now you have this sort of like software you can install, or maybe you use screen time. But the goal would be to have every site that a child or a young person uses. And in this case, a young person, the age would not be under 13. It would be, they're thinking about moving the COPPA age up. So the goal is to put essentially parental tracking features and filtering features on any large site that a young person might visit. And Bill, do you want to talk about why that doesn't work? I think that's an important thing that your technologist brain can get across better than I can.
Sure.
Sorry to interrupt you. Just to make sure I understand it correctly, will the parent be able to lift that censorship? Will the parent have authority over whether it's in place?
So yeah, that's a good question. Theoretically, yes. But one of the problems with KOSA is that the defaults are meant to be set at the strictest level. So if a child signs up, or in this case, let's say not even a child, a young person signs up to a website, maybe it's a social media platform or a forum, YouTube, what have you. And just to be clear, there's not like a technical description of how this would work. But if essentially you verify that this person using the site is under a certain age, then they have filters set up to limit the content that they can view, and they're set to their strictest settings immediately. And theoretically, however they kind of manage the parental portion of the control of that filtering or moderation, a parent could change those filters. But at least under KOSA, there's still a kind of strict legal duty for the platforms not to show young people certain content. And so even though you might say, well, I'm not worried about my child seeing XYZ, and you might raise those strict settings, the platform is actually liable if the young person encounters certain kinds of content that KOSA deems essentially dangerous. And so even though a parent would have some ability to change that, KOSA sets it up so that that ability is kind of superseded by this law and limits even the parents' control over what young people can see.
Thank you for this clarification. And Bill, I'm getting more concerned by the second.
Yeah. And I think that part of the problem with KOSA is that it's so broad in its mandate to make platforms legally liable for the contents that children see. So, for instance, there's a clause that any promotion of self-harm, suicide, eating disorder, substance abuse makes these platforms liable. And what this promotes is a dynamic where every single site, as Jason mentions, will have to implement self-policing algorithms. They can't really do this at scale with the content moderation mechanisms that they have currently. They'll have to build out more automated systems. And in order to make, limit the liability as much as they can, to be sued. As Jason like so elegantly put it in the blog post, that this is something that any single state's attorney country can sue based on, right? And putting aside for the moment the fact that states attorney general might consider content that looks up information about abortion potentially self-harm factor. Putting all that aside for now, there's this impetus for these large sites to over broadly limit what content is available on the platforms in general, just so that they won't be put in front of children, or I should say children or teens, anyone under or 16 or under. And so you have this self-policing mechanism that's going to be very overbroad in what it deems as potentially, content that the platform is potentially liable for. And this reaches down the stack of web technologies, right? So it's the websites, but there's no kind of clear, there's this huge gray area where that stops, right? There's the websites, and then there might be, content delivery networks. So the CDNs, which host a lot of the images, but don't necessarily post them, right? So you see, for instance, Amazon has a service called S3, and S3 is where you host images if you're not hosting them on your website yourself, on the server itself. So that's a web service that the content is determined by those that are hosting the websites, but they're actually, delivering the content to the end user. So Amazon will have to also implement something that limits the content that they are allowed to host and build out this entire infrastructure for them. It puts a huge burden, a technological burden, on companies hosting content on every level of the stack, right? And a huge expense. And so that limits innovation as well. That limits the ability for platforms to have free discussions or facilitate free discussions on their websites. And so there's, this huge risk of it stifling speech, not only for children, but across the board, because just in order to limit the amount of information that, or the types of information that kids get, there's going to be this overzealous mechanism at play that really cuts down on all types of content that anyone might see, in order for platforms to limit their own liability. As Jason mentioned, the age verification mechanism, that's going to be something that not only, in order to determine what age you are, you have to upload, a photo of yourself regardless of what age you are, right? So that's something that's being sent over the internet, and also raises questions of, okay, how is that sent? What is the security mechanisms that are in play? Is this something that could be subject of a data breach if there's information being sent about my biometric data, etc. Those are all elements of giving more data to these age verification systems, and just for the sake of protecting children, but it's also having an impact on society as a whole, because you're collecting more data and you have that being sent more places. So these are different various elements, and we've seen this with FOSTA and SESTA, this kind of self-censorship mechanism where you have content that is promoting safer sex, but that is interpreted as, or can be interpreted by states' attorneys as something that promotes human trafficking or sex work or whatever. In the FOSTA-SESTA case, is trying to limit human trafficking, but because of the wording of the bill, because of the putting the liability on platforms, because of the fact that states' attorneys, also in the case of SESTA FOSTA, can sue platforms, you have this overzealous mechanism of self-censorship at play, and it limits the type of content that users that are a world away from human trafficking, limits the kind of content that they can get, that they can no longer a search for safer sex, resources. So it has an injurious effect on the ecosystem as a whole. And I think that that's kind of what we're going to see if KOSA passes as well.
What is the chances that KOSA passes, in your guys' opinion?
That's a great question. Right now in Congress, there's a sort of debate happening between different camps and folks who are trying to figure out ways to, they would probably say to protect consumer data privacy, but within that kind of large tent are a lot of people also interested in minimizing, the dangerous content that exists online in terms of who sees it and how long it's online. So the different camps are kind of jockeying for position. And right now we have people pushing a large federal data privacy bill that would impact essentially all users. It's not a particularly strong data privacy bill. And it, at the moment, has preemption, which means that California, which has stronger privacy rights for its citizens and residents, would have to essentially change their laws to be less protective if this federal bill were to pass. So that bill is in play. Then you have a bill like KOSA, because there's a camp of folks who have read a lot of news stories, have seen a lot of supposed harms that online platforms cause to young people, and they want to start, rather than with a larger bill, they want to start with what they would consider a targeted bill that impacts young people, supposedly young people only. And then there's a third camp that after the overturning of Roe v. Wade is working to introduce better data privacy legislation for folks' reproductive health data. None of these camps at the moment are necessarily winning, I don't think. It seems like there's a lot of discussion of how these bills can move forward, but at the moment, I think we're worried about the Kids Online Safety Act in particular, because just of how broad the bill is and how impactful it would be on the internet ecosystem as a whole, and because it's so aimed at censorship and surveillance versus, for example, that federal data privacy bill, which is, even though it would create certain issues because of its preemption, it doesn't introduce the same kind of negative repercussions that a bill like KOSA would. So it remains to be seen how likely, frankly, KOSA is to pass. I don't think we can really guess, but we at EFF have written this blog post. We've talked to folks about our concerns with KOSA, and many other organizations have as well. We're not alone in this. And so I think we can, if we're being optimistic, we can say it likely won't pass in its current form because of the kind of conflict that's happening at the congressional level. But I don't want to say for sure, because that will jinx me and then it will pass.
Because the problem, the way I see it, is also with the current situation. Even if we, put the whole KOSA bill aside, what COPPA is doing is actually devastating my kids' online life, because I remember back, if I'm not mistaken, 2017, 2018, my son could, just being a very young kid, stream on YouTube. And he was already he started programming at 6, also thanks to YouTube.
Amazing.
Online. So he would teach himself, and he really wanted to share that. And of course he would maybe on the live streams get 8 viewers or something, but they would engage and comment. And I was right next to him, because obviously I'm not saying that every kid should just be left to their own devices. It's all about our being available and the role of the primary caregiver being available and there for them. But in general, we encountered no problems for about maybe a year or maybe even 2 years that he was doing this. Sometimes on a weekly basis, he would for 2 hours stream JavaScript and Java tutorials. And then he stopped doing it because he just found it too much work and switched to just doing YouTube content, recorded. And then 2 years ago, that was exactly 2 years ago in November 2020, he decided he's going to do a much more sophisticated live stream now that he's older. We bought him a green screen. As an animator, I made intros and countdowns. And and he was really well prepared. And he's like, I'm going to solve these really intricate math puzzles using Python, timed, and see how people can do that with me, work along. So everything live. And he was really excited, and he got like some viewers already. And 18 minutes into his live stream, he was just really bluntly cut short, like everything just stopped, and he was completely devastated because when it happens live, you're very much stressed up and you're like, what's happening. So basically what happened was that they took his live streaming rights away, and I was sitting right next to him, but because he was under 13 and my face apparently should have been on camera as well, but you can hear my voice even like that I'm next to him, but that wasn't good enough for them, and our whole appeal didn't work. And now 2 years later, he still doesn't have his live streaming rights back, and the effect that has had on him was huge. He hasn't dared to reveal his age anywhere, while I think that would be really beneficial in his case, because he is capable of so many things at such a young age that could help him to meet more mentors, meet more like people to collaborate with, because you can actually attract attention to your talent if you say, look, I'm this old and I can do this. But now he's not showing his face, he's not showing like this. Actually, it's an obstacle in his growth and meeting the correct people, but also like he now is past that threshold of 13, and still he says, I'm so much afraid that this automatic algorithm, like if I start, for example, streaming on Twitch, that it's going to stop me just because my voice can be considered too young, or just because they will make an assumption that I'm under 13. So, and this has too much of an impact on me psychologically. I'm not going to do that. And I think, I know he's not the only one who has had this problem. And I think it's just the most talented youth, also technologically talented, are being strangled in this.
I mean, I'm sorry that happened. And that also, kind of raises this other point where you have people with disabilities that like growth, disabilities, and they're forced to prove their age in a way that an algorithm would, for instance, just rule them under a certain age, right? Like this is not, a lot of the time, when, in Jason's case, when he brought up is that you're sending, a photo and it's just an algorithm just determining, how old you are. And there's no rigorous process around that, right? And so it has a discriminatory effect against people that have growth disabilities, for instance. I'm not saying that that's the case here. I'm just saying that like in the case where you have people, for whatever reason, look younger than they are, then, you have an algorithm determining that they can't participate fully in online society, online platforms.
Yeah. It's definitely, I mean, this is such a, I would say, I don't want to say interesting because I don't mean to discount it, but it is a really interesting example of how these sorts of laws that are intended to protect young people can go awry, right? Whether it's, because, and I don't have enough knowledge about YouTube streaming or other streaming sites to know exactly what element of the law they're trying to implement to minimize a under 13 person's ability to stream. I can certainly think of ways that they might be imagining to, protecting their liability by doing that.
But the fact that it doesn't come back once you turn 13 is also quite interesting.
Yeah, it's very strange. I mean, what Bill said, I think, is true on that scale and also on an even larger scale. Like, it's these bills that try to implement a sort of large scale change to how internet platforms work are going to have impacts on everyone. And often the most negative impacts are going to be on a certain group of people, whether that's marginalized groups, people with disabilities, young people who are precocious, right? Like that's essentially what's happening here is like a smart young person, moving out of what YouTube or whatever platform thinks is his lane. before they expect him to. And we've seen similar problems. Just to give you a quick story, EFF has a podcast and called How to Fix the Internet, and we interviewed a founder of a coding educational site for young people, and that site's called Hack Club. I think the website is hackclub.com. And because of essentially tools in school that minimize, let's say, supposedly dangerous content that young people can view, Hack Club, which has thousands of members, lots of kids all over the country and all over the world who are learning together to code, can't access the site in school because it's blocked by various tools that are intended to protect young people.
Don't you think it's sort of part of this whole coercive paradigm that education has become, that schooling has become, that you're sort of supposed to do this now at this age and do this at this age?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that a lot of this relies on the false assumption that the more kids are surveilled and the more kids are controlled, then the better it is for them. And I think that's just the opposite. You have the natural development of someone who is going from an infant to a fully fledged human being. And the best thing you could do for a child in that case is to have them naturally explore what they're interested in, and not set up these artificial barriers at every stage of the process. And I think that whatever the intention of these types of bills are, they're setting up barriers to the natural learning cycle of a child.
Exactly. And also, if you have to every time to facilitate that as a supportive parent, create a false age account, false identity, that also prevents the streamlined identity of the child online, because all his accounts say that he's not the age he actually is, or maybe not even the person he actually is, and that obstructs his further down the road his portfolio or his ability to prove that he actually did this at age 10 or whatever. And the algorithm being able to follow him, because in my son's case, for example, YouTube algorithm was beautiful job, and he's always, don't mess with my algorithm, don't watch anything on my account, because it brought beautiful people into his life, some of whom became in real life his mentors, or he's even the way he speaks English now, all of that comes from YouTube, because originally his native language is Russian and Dutch.
I think you have such a good example of the positive benefits and elements of these online platforms. And it's really good to hear such a positive example, even though obviously he's been obstructed in these ways, because we so often hear only the negative. And I think that that's what journalists cling to. And that's part of why we have laws like KOSA, because you only hear how dangerous YouTube is, not how positive it can be. And it's really nice to hear that it's worked.
Not only YouTube,
or the whole internet. Yeah.
I don't know. I get the impression that that's even stronger in California for some reason. Maybe because of demonization of many high-tech companies or corporations.
I think that there is an animus, a sort of distrust, a dislike for a lot of big tech companies, and I get it. I don't think most of us are huge fans of Meta / Facebook. I don't think most of us at this point think these companies have our best interests at heart, at least not most of them. And I think that there is an awareness on the part of politicians that it's a cross partisan issue. People on the left and the right, people in the middle, they all agree that Facebook sucks, right? And so in California especially, I do think, it's complicated by the fact that if you live in the Bay Area, at least you have many friends who work for these companies. But there is, I think, a bigger awareness of just how problematic some of the policies are and some of the things that happen as a result of these large tech companies. And I wouldn't, again, it's easy to find those negative stories. There's all sorts of problems, but it's also really refreshing when you hear all the positive things that the internet can do, especially for young people. And I wish more people were able to hear stories like that, because it would help add nuance to these conversations that often end up just with an outcome where young people's rights are restricted, supposedly to protect them, versus thinking about how access to information might actually benefit them and other people, but young people in particular.
I was completely appalled recently listening to a podcast about technology where also a Bay Area based psychiatrist from Stanford University was interviewed, who like writes books about how people get addicted to social media and stuff. And she was like saying, oh, how relieved the Chinese parents must be that the Chinese government has now introduced, this ban on gaming for kids for so many hours per week, and like that they're using like facial recognition to I mean, I couldn't believe my ears when I was hearing that this person was actually saluting such developments, not realizing that not only are they completely detrimental, and she's actually a mental health specialist, detrimental to your development, because obviously technology is like our very important part of our culture, and raising people like boxed within a curriculum and not allowing them to freely experiment with it means that they will be very limited in their creative ways to use it in the future. But even apart from that normalizing these kinds of surveillance and censorship technologies by the government can open all sorts of new ways also for people way beyond the minor age to be surveyed. And if we say it's okay to use facial recognition for policing, how far can we go further? I mean, that people don't see that the children is only like a subset of where it can be rolled out.
That's that touches on this issue of how a lot of these bills are targeted at addictive behaviors too, and what that encompasses, as Jason puts in the post, can be all sorts of things, right? Like, where does addictive behavior of gaming and addictive behavior of like Roblox, which is maybe this much more collaborative environment and building things, or Legos, for instance, it's kind of like a digital Legos platform in a lot of ways, or collaborating on like Discord or Zoom or whatever in order to learn how to play strings on a guitar or something like that. Like the gray area that encompasses from one end to the other is enormous, and there's no anything that targets like what is supposedly addictive behavior is going to try to target every one of those things, and just in order to avoid the liability of saying that it's promoting addictive behavior. And that is going to limit kids' ability to collaborate with others, to explore, to use platforms in a deeper and more engaging way in order to solve problems. And that's the whole problem with all these bills that are kind of targeted towards addictive behaviors.
And also that they're sort of being prescriptive in the ways that we should use technology and what we should learn and at what age.
I have a so as Bill kind of alludes to, one of KOSA's features, features, however you want to put it, is that it wants platforms to minimize patterns, supposedly to be able to minimize patterns of addiction. And I would just challenge the authors of a bill that talks about something like this to think about their own kind of use of the internet and use of platforms, because kids aren't different species from adults. And so, I mean, my job is sitting at a computer all day. That to many would look like a pattern of addictive behavior. If you had to stop people at the Electronic Frontier Foundation from using Zoom in a way that was addictive or appeared to be addictive, I don't know that we'd have any meetings. And we're all constantly doing multiple things online. We're having meetings with people. We're looking things up on a web browser. We're looking at an app. We're checking the weather. We're watching a video on a streaming platform. We're streaming. We're looking at social media. When we get into a groove where you're really like focused on something, whether that's because you're learning a guitar chord, by watching a YouTube video over and over again, or you're talking about your homework on Discord with your fellow students from your elementary or your high school, those grooves could be seen easily as addictions, right? And it's very difficult for a platform to do anything other than say, oh, you've been on for 3 hours, you have to log off now. They don't really have a clear way that I can tell of determining what is addictive behavior, just like they wouldn't for me as an adult. Apparently I'm addicted to Google Docs, like that's that's my addiction. And so I think, Bill said a lot of this already, but I just think it's helpful for people who think about, well, young people are addicted to social media, to remember that young people are just people, and they have the same patterns of behavior in many cases, in the vast majority of cases, that adults do. And that doesn't mean they should be given unrestricted access to whatever online, websites and social media platforms and apps they want at any age. But these bills often are written in a way that makes it seem like a platform can make determinations about young people that it couldn't possibly make about adults. And I just want the authors of bills like this to really think about, if you can't do it for adults, how are you going to be able to do it for young people? And that doesn't seem to be their concern, but I think it's a helpful rubric to go off of. And if you can't implement the same kind of protections for adults that you would for young people in the bill, then you probably shouldn't be doing it at all. Like, that's a kind of rubric I use to think about bills like this.
Just like John Carmack has put it so beautifully, most of greatest discoveries, they come from obsessions, from really digging into stuff and spending hours and hours on a problem. And I think we should also consider how much more democratic that learning process is now, especially for people who have less money or less access to good teachers, that they can take those hours online, even like you said, learning guitar or whatever, that would have been an offline activity otherwise.
Yeah.
Or maybe even credentialized education, or not credentialized, but like in doing it in small chunks rather than taking the official route, which is much more expensive. And all of that is being packaged by the authors of such bills more as an entertainment industry, or some kind of industry that is trying to lure consumers into advertising products to them, rather than the world's knowledge library, which it actually is. Of course, it has all sorts of things, but mainly it's the humanities, whatever we've achieved so far library. And I think that if children can be introduced to it in that way, rather than here's your passive entertainment for when you're already completely tired, you have 1 hour to do this, to do the passive stuff. I think we like look at it from completely different angle, because now by having so much censorship, it's also being framed as this kind of forbidden fruit. So like, if you have very limited time, you would probably, especially if you're tired after school, choose like the less energy consuming or brain energy consuming activity, rather than if you have it sitting there anyway and you always have unlimited access, you would go explore and not look at the clock all the time, how much time you have left. I in general think that it's a shame that children have the phone very often as their first personal device rather than a laptop. I think like a laptop for every child, but not a laptop in the sense the way the accountability apps wanted, like a Chromebook that's censored and not even a real laptop in that sense, but like a real window,
functional laptop.
functional laptop
Yeah.
allows for so much more active agency, than a telephone.
Yeah, I think it's funny, like, because when you have bills that are going to limit the actions of kids online, they're also going to limit the unforeseeable and creative ways that children use platforms. I'm thinking of, for instance, the fact that kids in China are able to circumvent censorship because of the way that they use video games. Video games, the quintessential example of addictive behavior. Well, kids are actually using the in-game chat platforms
Exactly.
in video games to get information that they can't through the normal mechanisms because those websites are blocked within China.
Yeah.
So their chat runs internationally, and they're able to get that information from their friends, in a way that is completely unforeseeable, not even on the radar for legislators, because they're just seeing video games as addictive,
And purely entertainment or time killing in the eyes of the old generation, while that is actually the cradle of, I think, what the metaverse will look like. Because like the way I see, for example, my daughter using the game environment, it's just like an extension of life. She steps in there, and that's where she has meaningful contacts, because she is not comfortable very often. Like, she's very shy, and in physical reality, sometimes difficult to meet like-minded people. But many people online think she's a lot older, like based on her vocabulary and the way she arguments and such stuff. So she meets friends that are a couple of years older that she would probably not have met in physical reality, because she looks younger and they probably don't have any context of meeting each other. And she has built up such meaningful friendships, and they talk about, like, for hours every day about very deep philosophical concepts. But to people who have no idea that this is the extension of their reality, this is their reality, they think they're just doing mindless stuff. I think this is also the problem of politicians very often coming from a very, very different background and different generation, and now with things developing so quickly, I think they cannot even imagine what the way kids view the world and the way communication is happening. That reality has bleeded into virtual reality by now.
I have I'm almost 40, so it's not like I'm young, but it's funny when I hear people in their 50s who have such a different experience of the internet than I did, because there was a huge shift in 1990 or so, 1995. I very much sympathize with your daughter and your son. I was on Internet Relay Chat, IRC, when I was 12 or so, and I had a channel, which is like it's a channel. We all use that term in other ways now, but it's the same thing. Called Thinking 101, because I thought of myself as a philosopher. Yeah, not literally, but I was just like, I want to talk about big ideas, and I was 12, and I regularly had 10 or 15 people in this channel every day, and they were much older than me. The vast majority of people on irc.netcom.com were probably in their 20s, 30s, or 40s, and that was 25 years ago. And the idea that politicians still don't understand the benefits that you're describing, right, for your daughter and your son is somewhat mind-blowing, because this is a story that we've, at least for me, I've heard over and over, and it somehow still hasn't reached the people just a decade older than me, and many people my age as well. But yeah, I think that you have a great story with your kids, and it's definitely one that I think a lot of people relate to.
And also, we shouldn't forget that many kids are not lucky enough to have such mom as I am. And, they parents blindly follow the advice of policing their kids' access to the dangerous internet, or even maybe, they live in countries where different kinds of ideas are considered dangerous. Like you mentioned, China. I originally come from Russia, and what is going on there is that children are literally being castigated for bringing up peace in chats and like being against the war. It's very Kafkaesque, but these same technologies naturally, or if you go what you already mentioned about like mental health and abortions, or people who just want to for research purposes know about their gender issues, or whatever is being suppressed in some southern states in the United States. We don't have to go far. What is normal, what is dangerous, and who are we to decide that for kids, and especially for teenagers? I believe that what we see now is very much akin to the way reading used to be considered dangerous for girls in Italy a couple centuries back. And everybody said that you're all just gonna get all sorts of ideas from there, and you're idle, go do your chores.
Right. Yeah. I mean, kind of dovetailing off of what Jason said earlier about IRC, I remember, Internet Relay Chat, the same platform that Jason was using, and I used it too, and that being seen as kind of an addictive behavior, right? That being seen as something that, oh, you shouldn't be, just chatting all day with your, friends online or whatever, that you should be out playing ball or whatever, the fact might have been. But in fact, IRC was the way that the breaking news of the fall of the Berlin Wall happened too. It's like that was the platform that information was conveyed on. And what's seen as something that is doing a social ill, and actually kids are the first to use those same platforms for social good, or for in creative ways that wasn't foreseen, wasn't kind of just for addictive behavior, but also for creative and growth behavior. So yeah, I think that's kind of funny how that happens, like this kind of prescriptive older generational kind of idea of these technologies should be censored or taken away from the hands of youth. Well, actually, they're the ones that are using that are kind of creating contexts within these technologies that are facilitating their blossoming as a human.
And I think in terms of safety, I at least like when I watch my daughter talk to strangers, right? Obviously we like discuss this a lot. I think that's a very important part of it, that you build up a trusting relationship with your kids, as opposed to policing them and making this a forbidden fruit, like I said, because then they'll just do that behind your back, which is much more dangerous, and not come tell you when it goes wrong, which is even more dangerous. But she, at her young age, she's actually coaching 16-year-old girls how to block creeps. And because she has developed this hunch for what is like, this makes her feel uncomfortable, so she's gonna block that if somebody asks her like in her opinion, the wrong questions. Or she's very assertive in her online behavior because it comes with experience. And I can imagine that if she only had very limited experience that was micromanaged by school or by me as a parent, she wouldn't rely on her own experience, on her own feelings, and just becoming at ease in this environment. It's just like going outside. Like if you only allow someone on a leash sometimes to go outside, they're gonna not know how to cross the street or how to answer when somebody approaches them. It's a matter of getting used to that environment where they will probably spend like most of their working lives and creative lives, and it's going to get all the more versatile and the data overflow is going to be increasingly overwhelming. So to be able to double check, to verify, to like know how to go about it, and to just be tech literate, I think this is a crucial component, is to get your hands dirty.
Yeah, that's 100% true. I think that digital literacy or tech literacy, that divide that you're describing, between a person with experience and a person without experience, is really the divide we're kind of fighting oftentimes in these conversations, because there are people with lacking digital literacy trying to push for those restrictions because they don't know how to manage their online life, and I'm not saying that it's easy. It does take experience, and it's changing and it's complicated. And I try, though I can't help my mom use Facebook. Like, she just can't figure it out. So I get that there's going to be a gap at times. But my mom also shouldn't be writing legislation about how Facebook should work. Right. And so I think one of the things we always talk about at EFF is the benefits of digital literacy versus the pitfalls of the restrictions that would keep people from gaining that literacy. And unfortunately, we're in a tumultuous time. Schools are constantly being politicized, and education is being politicized, and it's difficult to move young people forward to understanding how the internet works on a large scale. But they know that they need to know, and they're using it, and they're figuring it out, whether they're at school or they're homeschooled or whatever. I mean, there is an awareness, I think, that they need to know, because that's the future, and we can't really stop them. I mean, ultimately, these restrictions will have negative impacts if they're passed into law, but in reality, Bill mentioned a few times, like, young people are going to learn about politics through the internet, whether you try to stop them or not. They're going to talk in chat in games if you try to stop them from chatting in other ways. Like, you can try to plug all the holes, and I just don't think it's ultimately going to work. That's the benefit of digital literacy, is rather than plugging the holes, you're trying to educate people about how the landscape functions. And that should be our goal, I think, more than trying to figure out how to remake the platforms into things that are safe. I think it's impossible, because life isn't safe, right?
Exactly. Yeah, you cannot prevent everything from happening. Even if you just let your child sit on a chair in the corner of the room the whole day, imagining that nothing will happen to them, then certain health hazards will still be the case. But what was it exactly that happened a few years ago that COPPA started to be enforced in a stricter way? That story that I told about my son, that he could stream on YouTube first and then he couldn't anymore. I remember there was this whole story with YouTube people no longer being able to monetize with kids related content that was sort of at the same time.
I'm not, forgive me, I'm not exactly sure of what happened in that moment. I think you might have a better awareness of that particular instance, because, I mean, ultimately, COPPA itself hasn't changed in a long time, right? The law itself has not changed. But I think that over the last decade, we've seen these huge changes in what platforms exist and how they're used, and whether it's streaming or, upcoming VR, like all these different things, I think, come with platforms trying to figure out how to minimize their liability. And I'm not sure what happened there.
I see, like, they used to not ask, for example, on Discord what your age was. And now it's a lot stricter. Even on platforms like brilliant.org, there's this age. They're trying not to pay attention to it, and brilliant.org guys are great, but it's just that their lives are made so much more difficult. They don't want to implement those laws, but I get the impression that it's more and more strict.
I think that some of it comes from the fact that, even if these laws are, like KOSA aren't passing, then these platforms are building out tools just in case a law comes up which will pass, which does have legs. And so just because these injurious laws are being put on the table, they don't want to be in a situation where a law passes and they're immediately liable for what content they've delivered. And so I think that a lot of there's already this censorious or censorship effect in play even before these laws are passed, just because they're being taken seriously. And I think that platforms are building out tools because that's where the landscape is kind of shifted. And so, yeah, that's the fact that we're even seeing this change in landscape and the fact that platforms are censoring themselves even before these laws are taking effect, shows how seriously it's affecting, the fact that, you can't, you have, in the case of your son, their stream cut off, in 15 minutes in or whatever the fact, that's causing injury even before the laws passed. So, yeah.
And it's also sad to see how much effort and talent is now going into building accountability tech and selling it to schools and parents. Just imagine what beautiful things the same people could have built, but now they feel like the money is there in surveillance technology.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's what you said earlier. It's all about trust, and it's about having, instead of having all these technologies which are limiting the experiences of kids and, trying to protect them in ways that ultimately harm them. Instead of that, if you have trust in the kids and give them tools and give them contextualization for what they're seeing, then they have the proper guidance in order to protect themselves. And that's much more powerful than just blocking content or censoring their experience, because they're building up an immune system. They're actually building up the tools themselves in order to come, to interact with the online world. And
I love that comparison. The immune system. It's just like the islanders that never see anyone come in and never have contact with any diseases, even minor flu. That's deadly for them.
Yeah, that's going to translate into their adult lives too. Because predatory behavior doesn't just happen to kids when they cross that 16-year-old threshold. In the case of KOSA, if they haven't built up those tools beforehand, then, it's not like the predatory behavior is going to just stop. So if they have those tools built up because of their contextualization, because of the trust the parents place in them, because of, knowing that, here are tools that you have in your toolbox to properly kind of situate yourself in the online world and know what that predatory behavior looks like, then they can better go into adulthood, with those tools and with that, immunity in place.
Yeah, and I think also owning, like I see with self-directed learning in general, owning that knowledge, because that was your choice, your responsibility, and it sort of sticks with you. It's not something imposed from outside. And the same goes for, I think, owning what you have made, what you are, like self-discovery, and ultimately your data. I think it would be so much more productive to start creating this culture where kids own their data from the very start and get educated that way about what their data is, with whom they want to share it. And if we, instead of throwing so much talent, so much resource in those prohibitive technologies, that we start rethinking our whole relationship with data, and how all of us, no matter how old we are, start being able to opt in or opt out at a click of a button, whether we want to share our data, and everything belongs to us.
I could talk all day about our broken models of, data privacy and consent. And you're 100% right that if I was a young person coming up today, I would benefit so much from an awareness that I didn't have when I was young about how data collection works, right? And what value of data is. And I think, I do think young people are getting a sense of it more than I did, because it kind of was created as I was a teen and in my 20s, the kind of surveillance capitalism ecosystem. And I think your point about the energy being put into these prohibitive or, protective or surveillance kind of oriented tools, it's a fascinating problem, because in many ways the issue is what is profitable, right? If data is profitable, and it is, then it's going to be collected. If that means that platforms are filled with things that some people think young people shouldn't see, well, now it's profitable to build a tool that protects people from that horrible ecosystem that profitability created, right? And so if you could trace it down, like, I think even some of the issues we see with these protective or supposedly protective tools at root are based in our sort of surveillance capitalism system, where data is, stolen, collected, rarely given with real consent, and used to target ads or sell or what have you. It's not for me to go into the details of how these things connect, but I think it's worth thinking about how, the money that is involved in these systems drives where the talent goes. And I hope that in the future we will be doing less of this building of surveillance tools. But for the moment, it seems to be profitable because people really want to protect kids, whatever that means,
Well, I believe that what they're actually achieving is protecting the consumerist model that I'm afraid our whole educational system is also reinforcing. Because as opposed to like I said, somebody owning his own path, they're being talked about like reasserting control. I'm reading from one of those accountability apps, over what is being consumed. So the child is right away being framed as a consumer also in their own eyes, as opposed to a creator, an agent. And partially this stems from like so many tools being free to begin with, and then the business model is ad driven. As opposed to maybe if that was different, if we just paid a little amount and it wasn't free, but it wasn't ad driven, and then we would also own our data, whether it's blockchain based or not, in some way that we could really take our data with us to all the tools we're using, and we could also contribute, like pay something a little for using those tools. Maybe that could be a different way to go about it, or I'm sure there are many other ways.
Yeah. And, I think that this whole kind of idea of trusting students or trusting children to pursue their own education in a way that's a free, kind of like self-guided, but also like, yes, somewhat guided by parents, but not limited by parents,
facilitated by parents, I like to say.
Facilitated and provide a contextualization for it. That's like, this is something that has carried over into the online world, but was pre-existing too. There's been educational models in the past where, as I'm sure your listeners know, education and the idea of education has always had those two kind of halves, where most of it through the education of public schooling systems has been very strict, has been, very much about discipline. But there's also been different models, models which are explored, like Francesc Ferrer, I mentioned in email, where you have this kind of liberatory pedagogy idea where students are free to kind of pursue what their interests are and explore that. And I think that that's just taken a new dimension in the online world, where the access to information is so broad that, you can kind of delve deep into areas that you couldn't even conceive of. People didn't have, access unless you were in a major city where that, so, like where, for instance, number theory was being discussed, or there's access to periodicals where the ideas of the day were, in the central kind of physical nodes where you could go and learn about. But in most people's libraries, they didn't have that access. And now every person's device has access to Wikipedia and can look up and have resources even deeper than Wikipedia goes into subject matters. And so, that self-directed learning aspect can go even further, can go into subject matter in a deeper way than was previously possible. And I think that's a great thing. And I can't help but think that legislators don't think that that's necessarily the greatest thing,
because they feel like they lose control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right.
But what is
right.
what is your ideal world? Like, if I read on the website of EFF, you're saying that you want to fight for a world in which many worlds fit and build the technological commons.
I think that knowledge is always collaboratively built, right? It's not an individual pursuit purely for anyone. And I think that that's something that online world facilitates, brings people together in ways in which they can discuss and collaborate in new and innovative ways. And that's the ways that they collaborate. Kids are exploring the ways that those interactions happen are always novel, and it's like an ecosystem where the tiniest flower will fill a void if it's given an opportunity to. And I think that that's true when you give kids tools to facilitate communication. Then they'll use those tools to build collaboratively and to learn from each other and interact, just like we did when we were kids, although we didn't have the same tools. So I think that's very true.
And what do you think is going to happen in real world? Like, what is your prognosis in terms of, like, we already discussed whether KOSA will get passed or not, but in general, what kind of trend do you think we'll see in the near future and maybe more long-term future in terms of digital freedoms for kids and teens?
Augmented reality.
Like when augmented reality and large language models come for, get mass adopted, then kids will get even more opportunities to have very meaningful discussions and even relationships with maybe non-human entities. And if we just regulate that to death, we might just as well stop progress altogether, because you cannot, in my view, possibly micromanage that anymore. Or say, no, you're not allowed to at all use anything until you're grown up.
Or kids will just, communicate in code and create new terms. Like there's this phenomenon that happens in contexts where there's a mixed cultural background, where adults will start communicating just for the basis of having some shared language, and that's called a pidgin. And when the second generation comes about, the kids form their own fully fledged language on the basis of that pidgin, which becomes a Creole language. And that language is fully developed and fully kind of built out and becomes, a fully fledged language, just because they're, that was the basis in which they were learning on. And so, yeah, I think that's, I don't know exactly how that relates to the online world versus, when it comes into the real world. But yeah, they'll find a way around it, and just in the case of the online or video game in-game chat, you have ways in which they will circumvent it. I think that Jason is absolutely right in saying that, yeah, you can put roadblocks for their communication, but kids are much more innovative than that. And so the thing that's going to happen is that they are going to feel pressured. They're going to feel like there's this disciplinary atmosphere that's put on them, that their learning will be impeded but they're not going to stop creating and stop finding ways around it. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of, as true in the online world as it is offline. But yeah.
Well, that's very optimistic way to wrap this up. And maybe Jason can also give me some kind of prognosis.
I don't know that I can follow Bill in his pigeon and Creole conversation. I think really is 100% right. I mean, I'm definitely, I think, less optimistic in some ways than Bill is, but I think ultimately, if you do this work, you have to remain optimistic, and I think he is right that there is no real way to block people from doing what they want to do online. And whether that's, being educated, diving into figuring out how to code, streaming themselves, coding, playing guitar, or just chatting with their friends. Like the point you made about books being seen as dangerous for women at a certain point in history is, I think, a great example of how decades later you look back and think, I can't believe we just assumed these things were bad, And I think because young people are growing up the way that they are and they're so enmeshed in the internet, I'm really looking forward to their generation writing the laws about how those things work, or not writing laws about how they work, and as the case may be. But I do think for the in the moment we're in, things are going to get more complicated legally, not less, in the short term. Whether that's for young people or for data privacy or whatever it is. And as the technology changes, like you mentioned, AR, and VR, the laws are going to be behind. They're not going to be ready to proscribe how those tools or platforms should work. And that's how technology works. It's constantly evolving and it's constantly being used in new ways. And so I think we're still figuring out as a society how to push young people to use those tools in ways that are beneficial to them. And I don't know that we're going to figure that out for a while. And so I think we're going to see more laws like KOSA brought up. Hopefully we can protect young people's privacy while allowing them access to all the online tools that make them the best leaders to lead in the future and the best people to solve these problems that frankly we've created. And so, yeah, I'm optimistic on a long scale, but I do think the fight's still going to be happening for a while.
Because obviously, you can say that people will feel pressure and won't let themselves be pressured to when it's has passed a certain degree of pressure that it's going to explode. But if we look at the mainstream schooling, how much pressure there is there, and you just see kids break in like a lot of individual cases that probably don't end up in the media as much, but many kids break and they're being told that the problem is with them and that they just get some help and be pushed back in that traditional schooling. So I'm personally really afraid that that's going to bleed into the online, like the micromanagement and the hyper-regulation that kids experience in offline life.
Yeah. I mean, that I think you're 100% right. I have read studies about the pressure that is on young people today and how intense it is in school compared to what it was 20 years ago. And that is creating a problem for young people's mental health. And then the problem, of course, is that it's much easier to legislate the social media platforms. I mean, it's not easy, but it's easier than figuring out how to, fix college admissions and costs and all the things that are making school for young people complicated. That's just a huge, messy system. And I'm confident that if you ask most young people which two things that make them feel like their life is despairing, I think they would pick school over social media. I think they're more critical of the pressure that's put on them by our system of education and frankly our economic system than they are concerned about social media. But unfortunately, one of those is an easy punching bag. And so I think you're right that we're not going to see huge changes, I don't think, in the near future to that kind of pressure in schools. But I certainly hope that we will eventually, because until we solve that problem, we're going to be going after these straw men like social media, and they're not necessarily not to blame for certain issues, but I think if you talk to young people, you'll find that the actual issues are different than what legislators want to solve.
They're just like augmenting the actual issues. They're putting them under a looking glass.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they're distorting them, and I think there's an opportunity for every person, I think, to come out of their educational experience thriving, and there's an opportunity for everyone to use the internet in a way that helps them learn and also helps them thrive generally. And I don't think we know how to make that possible for every single student and every single person. I don't think we can make it possible for every single person.
Well, not like a standardized scale.
Exactly, not on a legislative.
But now, for the first time, we have the computational capacity to make it individualized for everyone. And I think the crucial component of what you're saying to make it, to create the potential for flourishing for everyone, is that everybody has a choice.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I mean, we are in a very interesting moment, and we have all these tools and we have all these opportunities. And you're absolutely right that we have more ability to educate and help young people, and we're not necessarily going about it the right way. But who knows? It could be hugely changed 15 years from now, and hopefully something will be hugely changed. And it won't be social media has now you're unable to use social media until you're 18. Hopefully that's not the change that we see.
Well, I just hope that some kind of more awareness about self-directed learning is created, obviously, because there's just more resource online, and that grows and grows and bulges as sort of this alternative path to learn. And whether we do anything about the existing system or not, that alternative is just going to grow further. And that's what I'm betting my money on.
And I think you're part of that. And this conversation is part of that. And I think it's great that you are pushing that forward. And I'm really excited to see where that goes. And I'm glad you're bringing EFF into it. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you guys so much. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you so much. It's great to talk to you.
This was a conversation with Bill Budington and Jason Kelley from the digital freedoms nonprofit Electronic Frontier Foundation, or EFF. Please check out the links to EFF and other resources in the show notes. To support this podcast, to join my Discord server, and if you want to help brainstorm for my upcoming book, free to browse, please visit my website, UnschoolingFuture.net. Talk soon.
UnschoolingFuture.net